What's up, everyone? Tailwind CSS has many great out-of-the-box utility classes that should cover a majority of your needs. But what if you have a specific use case that Tailwind doesn't cover? Or what if you have long and complicated arbitrary values that are just easier to read as inline styles? And finally, what if you want to use data from a CMS like Payload CMS to render a class name? That's where inline styles can help. I'll cover when you should use inline styles, as well as how you can use static constants to pull in data from your CMS as class names. If you want the code that I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. When you use Tailwind CSS, it doesn't necessarily replace inline styles. In fact, using inline styles can come in handy when a value is coming from a dynamic source, like a database. For example, we can go to our pages collection config and add a few new fields. So I'll come down to our fields array here, and we're going to add first a new named group called Tailwind example, and it'll be type of group. This group is going to have a fields array, and in the fields we'll have a button color, which will be type of text, and I'll duplicate this twice so we can do text color, and finally background color. Now we can run payload generate types, and now we can go to the page.tsx file that renders our page collection. Above our return statement here, we're going to destructure our page, and we're going to get our Tailwind example from it. Then we are going to get our background color, text color, and our button color out of Tailwind example and provide a fallback value. Then we'll change our fragment here to be a div, which will have a style of background color, which will take background color or an empty string. Then in the H1, we'll include a style, which will have a color of text color or an empty string. And then finally, we will comment out our render blocks, and underneath our H1, add a new div that will just have the text button and give that a style attribute of background color, button color, or an empty string. Now we can start our development server by running pnpm dev. Now we can go to our admin panel and go to our home page, and now we can assign some random hex values to each of these here. So I can save these changes and publish them, and we can refresh our homepage and see how it impacts our front end. If you find yourself adding a lot of utility classes with advanced CSS calculations, it might make sense to use inline styles instead. This will typically improve readability. One last example for inline styles that I'll provide is setting variables given from a CMS to be used in a Tailwind utility class. Let's use our same values from before, but change some things around. We'll just copy and paste our previous example and comment out the old example. And we're going to change our style attribute here. We'll include a BG color, text color, and button color variable. And this is valid code, so I can just do ts_ignore here. And then these can be used in our classes using parentheses. We can add a class name that's going to be our BG, and then our BG color. And then for our H1, we can add a class name that's going to be our text, and then our text color variable. And then finally in our button, we'll add a class name that's going to be our BG, and then our button color variable. Now when I save this and refresh over here, nothing should change because we're using the same values as before. But looking in the code, we can select an element. Now we can see how these class names get rendered. Before we talk about Arbitrary CSS, check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel so you never miss when I release more content about Tailwind CSS, nextjs, Payload CMS, and other modern web dev technology. Tired of trying to keep up with all the news and updates across all the technologies and companies you use? Sign up for my newsletter to get a bi-weekly overview of all the dev news from across the internet. The link to that is in the description. Thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to it. If you need to break out of Tailwind's set utility classes and use specific values that you want to set, you can do this using arbitrary values or properties. Arbitrary values are set using the base part of a utility class and then adding a value and a set of square brackets. You can treat this as basically inline styles. For example, we can add to our background color here in our div a padding top and bottom of 13 rem using square brackets. And when we save this, we should see 13 rem be added to the top and bottom padding of the div. You can, of course, add different state variants and interactive modifiers here, like different screen sizes and hover. I might add something like hover text, and we can do a red color here. And now when I hover, we can see that our button text is changing from black to red. You can use arbitrary values for everything in Tailwind, like colors, font sizes, and pseudo-element content. As we did in our previous example, we could use our CSS variables we define elsewhere or in our style tag as an arbitrary value. For example, we'll just change our hover text to instead be hover button color. And now when we save this and hover, we should see the button text change from black to this pale green. If you need a CSS property that doesn't exist in Tailwind yet, you can also do that using the square bracket notation. For example, we can make this div into a circle by adding in square brackets our clip path and then add circle and then 25%. And when I save this, our front end turns into a circle. A major benefit of this is, again, the ability to use variants like hover and screen sizes. So we'll add a hover variant to this and just add hover to the beginning there. We'll also make the circle a little bit bigger. So now if I hover over the div, we see that it turns into a circle. You can also use arbitrary properties to set CSS variables. This can be helpful if you need different variable values at different screen sizes instead of setting a single static value in your style attribute. While we won't go in depth with this, you should know that you are able to use arbitrary variants using the same square bracket notation. This means you can use custom pseudo class or element variants that aren't included in Tailwind by default. So if you wanted to use a very custom variant to select some deeply nested child element, you can do that as well. You can use underscores if you need to use spaces in your variants, like for setting grid columns or the URL of an image. If you have a file name where underscores are actually included, you can use a backslash to escape the underscore so a space isn't generated in its place. If you're using JSX like I am, be sure to use the raw method on a string so the backslash isn't stripped incorrectly. I've done all this talk about square bracket notation and adding custom values, and you might be tempted to try to use the values we put into our CMS in an arbitrary value. Something like this, where we might add our square bracket notation and then interpolate our background color. And if I hit save, we'll see that our background color disappears. This doesn't work because Tailwind can't interpret interpolated data like this. The reason this doesn't work is because Tailwind works by scanning your project first for utility classes. Then it generates all the necessary CSS on the classes you've actually used. This process ensures that your CSS doesn't take up any more space than it needs to and makes arbitrary values possible. However, this process relies on the classes being available as text when your files are scanned. So this means you can't construct class names dynamically using ternary operators, and you can't use props to build class names directly. So what can you do? This is where creating a static constant comes into play. A different name for this might be something like a variant object, which is where we'll store a couple of key value pairs to store our varied component classes based on a key given by our CMS. To show this off, we'll go back to our Payload CMS pages config file and change our Tailwind example group text fields to all be select. And select fields take options, not fields, options. And we can pass in 3 different options, which will be white, red, and for us, we will also include black. Once that's done, we can come back to our admin panel. And once this refreshes, we'll see that our button color, text color, and background color have all changed types So we can add in different colors here. So we'll use red for our button color, black for our background color, and then white for our text color. Then we can publish our changes here. Now back in our page.tsx file, we're going to add 3 new constants, and I'll add it before this return statement here. We'll include our constant of background styles, which is going to include white, which will take the BG white utility class. We'll have black, which will be BG black, and then red, which will be BG red 500. We can just copy this and paste it for our button styles. And finally, we'll add one more called text styles, which will take text white, text black, and text red 500. Then we can add these in as class names using typical object notation. So I'm going to get rid of our style attribute here, get rid of this class name that's not doing anything for us, but in its place, we're going to include our background styles, which will take our background color and we'll give it a default value of white. Then in our H1, we will do our text styles with our text color with a default of white. And then we can do the same thing to our button div here, where we'll have a class name that takes our button styles with the button color or a default being white. So if I save this, we see our red background for our button, we see our white text for our H1, and then black background for our background color. Now for a sleeker way to do this, let's do our black or white and store it in an array where we'll have black and white. And then in our background styles, we can get our background color as a string, and we can check if not in our black or white array, and check if our background color is not included in that. If it's not, we can do our BG background color 500 because that's the default value I wanted. Otherwise, it can be just the background color because that'll come through as black or white. Here we need to make sure that this is a non-null value. Now again, we can just copy this to our button styles and change background color to be button color, and then change our text styles to be text color, and then our BG to text. Now if I save this and we refresh over here, nothing changes, but now if we wanted to go to our page config and add another color here, which we can add blue, we can save that, come to our admin panel, and we'll change our text color to blue and publish the changes. I can refresh and we can see that our text color has changed to blue there. There's a lot you can do with arbitrary values, properties, and variant objects in Tailwind CSS. Whether you're just looking to use string values from your CMS to set variables, your own preferred values and properties, or a predefined object to return a set of utility classes, you can do it all using the methods described in this video. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content about Tailwind CSS, nextjs, Payload CMS, and more. Also, consider subscribing to my newsletter to stay up to date with modern web dev news from across multiple platforms. There's a link for that in the description. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.